Hello there, Advanced Motion Design. Emily here. Today I wanted to talk about creating true 3D within After Effects. So far we've only worked with 2.5D layers in a 3D space, like you did for your stage exercise, which are looking lovely, by the way. Thank you for those. Today I wanted to talk about extruding a shape and making it actual true 3D, which you can see here from this top-down view. It's not just a flat, paper-thin shape. You actually can see the extrusion of the object. So if I click R to bring up my rotation on this text, because it is just a text layer, so this is extruded vector paths, and I rotate it along the Y, you could see that happening in the active camera view, but also from that top-down one. Or if I click on the second view, I could go to left, right, etc. And it just gives you more of a sense of the 3D. Now, this is part of After Effects because of the renderer within it. There's Cinema 4D kind of baked into After Effects. And Cinema 4D is a separate 3D program that decided to be confusing by calling themselves 4D. And it's a company called Maxon that create this. And so they built it in as a renderer within After Effects. And the default renderer is just called Classic 3D. This is what we've been using so far, and this is what gives you the ability to create 2.5 3D layers. So you can change which renderer you're using at any time, and it's composition versus project specific. So this one I have is Cinema 4D, but if I was to go to a different example, like this winter one here, by the way, you're not going to see this option unless you're working with a 3D layer, since this renderer specifically is about 3D layers. So if I click on my text that says winter, and I click on the little cube for 3D, then in the upper right-hand corner of my stage, I see this renderer option. So it's not always there. It's only when the layer is 3D, because it's the only time it's applicable to the layer. Now, Classic 3D is just what we've been working with so far. So if I clicked on my cube like I have here, we can see it's 3D because we have the X, Y, and Z handles here. So Y is vertical, X is horizontal, and Z is depth. So that's the one pointing right at us. And if we change that, it really just looks like scale. And then we have this winter JPEG behind it. We'll get to that in just a moment. But when you're working with the Classic 3D renderer, which is the default, you have that flat shape. So I'm going to go to two views here. And this is top down right now. You could see winter, this layer is, like I've said before, paper thin. There's no depth to it. But if we were to rotate it, it still has those XYZ axes. Now, depth, whether it's spatial or extruded, isn't perceivable without light. So even if we rotate this, it just kind of looks skewed. It doesn't look 3D. So we need to add a light in order to truly see a 3D object. And lights and cameras are 3D inherently, so they're not something that you need to make 3D. We're going to be talking about cameras in an upcoming lecture, but I'm going to go Layer, New, Light. And we do have a few options. We've been working with the spotlight so far. Honestly, that's the main one I use. Point and ambient just kind of do general lighting, which I feel like you can do through color correction if you want to lighten something. And parallel is like spot. I'll actually use that in this example. Well, I'll come back to that actually, just so we could kind of review what we did before. But spot is just that circular light where you have a cone that you can feather. And then, of course, we want cast shadows to be checked on. So it's not very impressive yet. We have this kind of radial gradient. In our top-down view, we can see our light. It's got our X, Y, and Z handles. We can see the cone here. Let me turn off transparency. So you can see the cone and the point of interest of what it's looking at. Now we don't have cast shadows, even though the light is set to that. If we double click, we can see our options. So let's say I wanted to change the cone feather or intensity. Normally when we change a light, we just have to double click on the layer. However, mine is not letting me. It's giving me this little knocking sound that you won't be able to hear. So if this happens to you, though it's never happened to me before, I'm going to go up to my layer menu and choose light settings. This is just like when you create a solid, which is just another type of layer. And if you wanted to change the color, you could go up to layer solid settings since it's contextual. So I'm just going to go to layer light settings. And here I can do things like change that cone angle and the color of the light. Let's go with an icy blue color, actually. I said that like it was scandalous or something. And I'm going to click OK. And then we're not seeing a cast shadow because the background isn't 3D. So just as a quick example, if we wanted that to be a solid, just layer new solid. I'm going to click OK. I'm going to make it 3D. And then you can actually see that the rotated text is kind of intersecting it from this top-down view. So I'm just going to click on the solid, and I'm just going to push that back along the Z. And usually when we move things away from us, they seem like they decrease in scale, so we're just going to counteract that. And the only thing we have to do here is let it accept shadows. Remember, the layer order doesn't matter when you're working with 3D objects. So I'm just going to twirl down the options for the blue solid. And under my material options, I just want accept shadows on, which apparently is on already. So that tells me that my text must not be set to cast shadows. So I'm going to go to winter, which is my other 3D object. I'm going to twirl down material options, and there's the culprit. So I want cast shadows to be on, and there's our cast shadow. So remember, we have to have the light set to cast shadow, the 3D subject be set to cast shadow, and then whatever the background is to accept shadows. If that was turned off, we could get rid of that as well. There's also an only option when it comes to the shadows, which is interesting if you're doing compositing and want just kind of a cast shadow from a character or actor. So working with 2.5D, like you saw with your stage exercise, definitely has some uses and could do some really cool effects. However, if we want something to truly have depth rather than just the perception of it, we need to change our renderer. So Classic 3D, which is the default, allows us to have lights and shadow, and then also just these flat layers in a 3D space. If we wanted to extrude this text, we would need to change the renderer to the Cinema 4D one. So one other thing about that is when you make a layer 3D, text always has text and transform as options. But when you make a layer 3D, it adds geometry options and material options. Notice how geometry options is grayed out. That's only available when you're using the Cinema 4D renderer. And that actually has a little icon next to it. That's another way that you can change which renderer you're using. So you can do it in the upper right-hand corner of the stage. If you have a 3D layer selected, you can twirl down the options and click Change Renderer. Or you can go to Composition, Composition Settings, and change it under the 3D Renderer tab. So, from all those options, I'm just going to click on this little upper right tab. And before I do that, just the material options available are ones we've already been working with, things like cast shadow, whether it accepts light. You can also do things like control the shininess of something. I've already extruded these examples, but I affected the shininess of them so that they become reflective in a way. And I'm going to be creating shapes like this in just a moment. But this is what the reflective and the specular shininess options mean. And we're going to go much deeper into those when we get into modeling 3D objects. So I want to add actual extrusion to this shape. So I'm going to change the renderer to Cinema 4D. And right away it does give you just kind of a cautionary note. So enabled is extrusion, reflections. It's going to curve footage. So that spring and winter image I put on the Blackboard site. It can't extrude a PNG or JPEG, but it can curve it, which gives you some interesting background options. And then it's going to disable things like blending modes, track mats, layer styles, etc. You won't be able to have a motion blur on a true 3D object, so there is some give or take, but you can change this back at any time. And so I'm going to click OK, and nothing dramatic happens except for now geometry options is something we can choose. So I'm going to collapse material options, and let's take a look at these geometry options. So we have bevel style, which is something you've probably seen in Photoshop or Illustrator. It just changes the edge quality. We've got the bevel depth. We've got the whole bevel depth, but none of these mean anything without extrusion. So extrusion adds depth along the Z of the object. And so basically it's 1 point perspective. And if I scrub the extrusion depth, you can see we actually get true depth going on here if my computer finishes previewing it. So you can see the edges here, and let's make the background transparent in this one. So you can actually see the depth of the object, and this is going to increase or decrease depending on how much extrusion you add. So this is a true 3D object in a 3D space. So when we rotate this, if we change the lighting, that's going to affect the overall imagery that we see. And you can see it casts the shadows differently too. Now, despite being true 3D, we still need light. If we turn the light off, the text doesn't look so great. So without having light on a 3D object, particularly an extruded one, we really can't perceive the depth at all. So I just have this really basic scene here, and I mentioned it earlier, so I just want to go back to, if I want to edit that solid, I can click on that layer and go to Layer Solid Settings, like I did for the light earlier, and then I can just change whatever I want for the color. So you could also add a fill or a gradient ramp or something else. I didn't change it very dramatically. It should not have taken that long just to update a color change, but that's just how my computer is working these days. Luckily, I already have an example that I worked on a little bit before lecturing. So I have my text here. I have it extruded already. This one I actually have a really slight animation where I'm just rotating it along the Y. This is still just third as far as quality level goes, but it still took my computer quite a while to RAM preview it. It took such a long time that I actually rendered this little bit, which is not a terribly uncommon practice. I rendered just this little bit here as winter MOV, and if you had a computer that was having difficulties with 3D, you could render these bits and kind of edit them together like you would with clips in Premiere. So it's not ideal, because if there was a change, you'd have to go back to the original and export it again, but it is a way of kind of saving the rendering of your computer if you have a lot of CPU heavy stuff, like 3D can be. Just as an example, if I change something here, I'm going to click on my text and I'm going to twirl down. That's not something we really played with before, but if I go to my geometry options, and since we're not rendering, let's go to full quality. Let's splurge a little here. Alright, so if I change the bevel type, you can see it just gives it a classy little edge there. And we can change the depth of that bevel, and we can change the extrusion depth, and then if I rotate this, you can just see it changes the way that that Z looks like. So we have this kind of angle right here of the bevel. So bevels are something you can do in Photoshop, Illustrator, or After Effects. But it's just a little beveled edge. It just changes what that looks like. So it's like a stroke, but a stroke that has 3D elements to it. So we're going to be working more with 3D objects, not only in After Effects, but also Photoshop, and eventually Cinema 4D itself. We're just using a renderer within After Effects. But if you go File, New, you can actually launch Cinema 4D Lite, which I'm not going to do right now. However, we are going to be using this in a few weeks, and so if you want to try launching it on your computer in the meantime, it might be a good idea just so we can problem solve anything that happens. Now, if this doesn't work on your machine, we always have Photoshop as an alternative. You have the Faux 3D in Illustrator, though we can make true 3D shapes in that as well. There's a lot of alternatives, and one of the big parts of this industry, in my opinion, is just problem solving and adaptability. So if one solution doesn't work, we can just go and find another one. So eventually we'll be building 3D in this modeling program, and this light version is part of After Effects. The full version is a totally separate program and has far more tools, but that would really be a class in itself. That's why this is advanced motion design and not just 3D, because 3D modeling has many, many facets to it. Let's rebuild an example from scratch here. I did this little winter scene, but I also have this spring image that I'd like to use. And so I'm going to make a new composition, and I'll do my 1080 by 1920. And I'm going to bring in my spring image here. Now, another thing that's interesting about the Cinema 4D renderer is normally when we do 3D to a flat image like this, we just get the XYZ handles, and I could just move it in 3D space, or I can rotate it, etc. So we've already done that in different files. However, if we add the Cinema 4D renderer to this, as opposed to classic 3D, we can go to our geometry options. When we look at the options within the text we just extruded, we have all these different options that we can do. So if I twirl this down, geometry options for a vector path or text has bevel style, depth, etc. However, for an image, it only has curvature and segments, but this is kind of cool. If you increase the curvature of the image, you create this kind of circular wrap, which is really good for backgrounds. Now, it doesn't appear as curved from above, but you can see this is almost more like one of those boards you fold for like a school fair and put images on. But if I increase the segments of it, we can make that nice and smooth. And then if you were to rotate something like that, it just kind of gives you the illusion of depth. So it's just a cool trick, because you wouldn't think of extruding or looking at those options for a flat ping like this or JPEG. But if I just kind of create this back and forth motion here, and if we RAM preview that, I'm just going to scale it up a little bit so we don't get those edges. And then I'm just going to go to one view, though just from the top-down view you could see it rotating. And if we look at a view from the left, you can actually see the edges of it, because it is a 3D shape. It's just a curved image, essentially. So this is just a cool way of creating a backdrop. Since we're talking about making flat shapes look 3D, I want to show you some other options that are actually in the kind of faux 3D category, just because even just rendering this little rotation here of this background, the Cineware renderer, which is handling the Cinema 4D one here, got up to 400% on my computer, which granted is a 2014 iMac, but yeah, 3D definitely can take quite a bit. So sometimes using the flat 2.5D is beneficial, just considering your hardware. And you can get this curvature using Cinema 4D. I'm going to switch back to Classic 3D, which is just going to get rid of that effect. You can see it's flat right here. And another way of kind of doing fake 3D is if I go to my Effect menu and go to Perspective. Perspective has, this is where we had Sphere before, so when we made our planets. However, when I rotate the shape itself, you can see it's definitely not 3D. We can simulate the 3D by going to the sphere options and rotating the actual image itself, but it's not a 3D object, as you can see from this left-hand view too. It's not an actual ball, but we would need to make a sphere using Cinema 4D. However, we do have a few other options here. So in addition to sphere, I'm just going to delete that. Under Effect Perspective, we have a few other options in here. So I just did sphere. You also have cylinder. So let me just rotate this towards us. I'm rotating in every other way. There we go. And so we can create a tube if we desired. That behaves a lot like 3D. So let me just switch to this view because you already can see it's flat. And let's just move this back a little bit. So I'm going to change the position of the Z so we can see the whole thing. You do have kind of fake lighting options too. So you could always animate these in addition, which I showed on the sphere the other day to kind of simulate like an eclipse or something like that. So any one of these is also animatable and just something you can do to kind of change up the way the effect looks. So again, just whatever you want to play with and do. I'm going to delete that cylinder effect. And if I go to Effect Perspective, there's also Drop Shadow. And this is the last one I'll talk about tonight, though I encourage you to play with some of these other ones. Drop shadow might seem like not a big deal, but when we're talking about 3D and render times, sometimes you might want something that just creates a simple shadow without needing 3D layers and a light, etc. So if I just add some text here, and not in that font, good lord, Snell round-handed, all caps, is not a good combination. You heard it here first. That's kind of creepy typewriter font, but if I go through fonts, we will be here all evening. So I'm just going to use Arial Bold and cop out because I care about everybody's time. I'm going to turn off this stroke color and just move this in a little bit. So it doesn't stand out very much, obviously, just because of the contrast, and I could add a stroke around it. I'm not a big fan of stroked text. But if we go to our Effect Perspective option and add our Drop Shadow, there's a lot of different things that we can animate here, like if we want to change the shadow color to be one of these nice yellow or orange hues, we can. We can feather the softness of it. If we wanted to have it kind of rotating around like the directional rotation of the sun, we can animate the direction of the light here. So just to prove how fast it is, if we were animating a spotlight doing this, it would take quite a while. But if I click U to see my keyframes, I just have those two directional ones, and it really renders without any problem. So 3D is great. But like I've said multiple times now, it really just depends on what kind of equipment you have. The only other thing I want to show you today, just talking about kind of the difference between true 3D and fake 3D, is maybe one of my favorite tools, only because it's in a category called obsolete. And I love After Effects for countless reasons, but it having an obsolete category is definitely one of them. If I go to my Effect menu, there's our obsolete category. And the old lightning is in here. I won't show you that, but you've probably seen it in many, many low-budget films. I'm going to just go to Basic 3D. So Basic 3D simulates 2.5D in After Effects, where it allows you to rotate along the three axes, but it doesn't add to the render time at all. So if you just wanted something kind of looking like it's going back in space or just at an angle, you could choose basic 3D. You could see there's no 3D axes here. Let me collapse our drop shadow options, but you just have swivel and tilt. So by using this basic 3D, we can simulate the 2.5D without any of the render time. I like using this as kind of a text intro. If you rotate it or swivel it to the point where you can't see it, usually just 90 degrees, it's a neat way of having it enter or outro a scene. So if I animate the swivel of this, so if we wanted to make an animation similar to our kind of spiraling drop shadow here, I can apply the basic 3D to my text by going to Effect, Obsolete Basic 3D. So remember, there's so many effects that we can always start typing it in here as well. So if you typed in 3D, a majority of them are going to be these 3D text presets, which are pretty fun to play with, though I definitely don't want to go through Bridge in a lecture. But basic 3D is right here. So you can also drag that onto a shape. So with the basic 3D, I'm just going to have it kind of enter by animating the swivel at 90 degrees. So I'm going to type in 90 and click on my stopwatch. I'll move my playhead forward, and then I'm just going to rotate it into existence. And so this is good for title sequences and things like that. And then you could actually just have it go back. So if I wanted this to pause here, I would copy the keyframes of where it currently is position-wise, and that creates a little plateau of movement. And then I could rotate this out however I please. I'll just do 90 again. So if we RAM preview this, we have text that rotates in and rotates out like 2.5D, but you can see it RAM previews really, really easily. This is half, but even if we go to full, it really doesn't take very long to RAM preview. So not necessarily very exciting, but fast, which is sometimes even more important. And just last little review, if I wanted this to be true 3D, I just have to make it a 3D layer and then change my renderer to Cinema 4D. And the only benefit there, you can see I lost my drop shadow. It got rid of any effects applied to it. But when we do that, and this is the main thing I want you to experiment with in this class, is if I go to geometry options, now I can extrude this and get a sense of depth, but only if I add my light. So my light, which is still blue. So if I go to layer light settings, normally I would double click. I'm going to change my light to just a yellow color here. And let's move this away from the text. And just for kicks, I'm just going to rotate the text a little bit too. And now we have this lovely aerial text in the middle of a field. So regardless of how you work with this, I just want you to experiment with the extrusions and working with the Cinema 4D renderer within After Effects. See how your computer works with it. You don't need to turn in an exercise using this. I just want you to experiment with the technique and just get used to the different options that it gives you. Don't forget to work in a multiple view workspace whenever you're doing 3D, whether it's 2.5D or the real thing, just because it's going to give you a much better idea of what's truly happening. And when we add things like cameras, it's going to be really important to be able to see that. And so I hope that you have fun working with this.